Hi, I'm Nick Birmingham. To make the arrow spacer, I'm going to use a piece of 3.5mm thick vegetable tanned leather, at this stage unhardened. I've taken the design of the spacer from those that were recovered from the wreck of the Tudor warship Mary Rose, which featured 24 holes. I created the layout on my PC, printed it out to scale, and this would then act as my template for marking out the design. If you want a copy of this template, then just message me your email address and I will send it to you in PDF format. To begin, I marked out the centre of the disc using a darning needle, simply tapped in lightly with a hammer. I then marked the centre of each of the 24 arrow holes, which incidentally are 17mm in diameter or 5/8 of an inch, and then each of the small holes around the outside, which will be used later to sew the disc into the bag. I have made these holes 4mm in diameter. Once the paper template is removed, you can see that the centre of the holes are marked quite clearly on the leather. I then marked the perimeter of the disc using a compass, using the centre hole to mark a diameter of 170mm or about 6 3/4 inches. At this point, I'm now ready to begin cutting out the holes in the disc, and for the larger arrow holes I'm going to use a spring-loaded hole punch with a 17mm cutting head. For the smaller sewing holes I'm using a standard leatherworker's hole punch. To ensure I had a solid surface to work on, I then went outside, using a paving slab as the base with a thick rubber mat on top. I then proceeded to cut out each of the holes in turn. I actually found this process a lot harder than I imagined, and I think the rubber matting under the leather was part of the problem, as it was too springy, making the hole punch jump, which made a real mess of my first few holes, and I had to throw that piece of leather away and start again. The rubber also blunted the cutting edge of the hole punch really quickly, and after every 4 holes or so I had to resharpen it. In hindsight, it would have been better to put the leather on a piece of softwood, such as pine. Even better if the grain were edge on to provide a softer cutting base. The sewing holes were a lot easier to cut, I guess because the surface area was a lot smaller. However, I got through them all eventually, and here is the disc with all the holes neatly cut out. When it came to cutting out the disc, I didn't have any scissors strong enough to cut through this thickness of leather, so I used some garden pruning shears, which worked really well. I left the cut just shy of the actual line and finished off with my sander. I then finished off all the edges with some fine wet and dry sandpaper. For most people, the spacer could now be considered as finished, but a number of the Mary Rose spacers had small slits cut into the side of each hole, possibly to accommodate broadhead arrows, so I decided to do likewise. I don't have the exact measurements for these slits, so I made mine about 3/10 of an inch long. These were measured and marked in line with the centre of each hole. Then, using a width of 2/10 of an inch for the base, I turned these lines into small triangles. and then cut them out with a sharp knife. Although the leather had started out rigid enough, cutting the holes had made it quite flexible, so I decided to harden it by soaking it in hot water. Unfortunately, I had problems finding the correct temperature. Too hot and the leather curled up and shrank excessively, too cool and the leather remained unchanged. Rather than risk destroying all my hard work at this stage, I decided to use a hot air gun instead, where I could have much more control over the process. In case this process is new to you, leather is made up of protein fibres known as collagen, which shrink when exposed to excessive heat. This shrinking process increases the density of the leather, which makes it harder. Using the air gun, I applied heat to the surface of the spacer, keeping the gun moving at first so as not to burn the surface, but as my confidence grew, I held the gun closer and closer, and as the leather heated up, I could watch the spacer begin to curl up as the fibres began to shrink. To stop the spacer curling up too much, I stopped frequently to flatten out the spacer so it didn't lose its shape. I also measured the diameter to keep track of the amount of shrinkage, and after the loss of about 1/4 of an inch, I decided that was enough. Before I was happy with the finished spacer, I wanted to give the leather a deeper colour, something closer to the rich dark brown of those from the Mary Rose, even though I realise that colour is more the product of centuries under the ocean than the original colour of the leather. To achieve this, I used some walnut coloured wood dye, dabbed on with a piece of cotton wool. Interestingly, the dye took much better after the heat treating process with the heat gun than it had done with a piece of untreated leather that I used as a test piece earlier. And here is the finished spacer, after the dye has been allowed to dry for about 24 hours.